Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our webinar today. We have two ThoughtWorks experts here with us to discuss legacy modernisation. Faye and Mike will draw on their transformation and delivery experience to provide what we think will be a meaningful 30 minutes of practical advice on successfully delivering complex transformation projects despite these challenging times. But first, a quick word about ThoughtWorks. We're a global software consultancy and we're really driven by solving some of our clients' toughest problems with technology. We work across sectors from public sector to financial services, retail, health and life sciences. I'm Amy Stevens. I'm head of marketing here at ThoughtWorks. I'm your host, which effectively means I'll be answering and managing the Q&A. We should have some time for your questions at the end. Please send them through the Q&A function. I'm now able to hand you over to Mike Bevan, Portfolio Delivery Director here at ThoughtWorks. Mike has extensive experience working across public and private sectors in major organisations on large, high-profile and complex programmes. Mike is joined by Faye Roth, our Consulting Services Director. Faye specialises in technology and change delivery and has worked in both consultancy side and also client side in tech leadership roles, organisations such as Centrica, M&S and ITV. I'll hand over to you, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Amy. So I'm going to start off being a little bit philosophical and talking a bit about legacy. Legacy is a term that's been around for a long time. It's almost like a legacy term in itself. But we normally use it to refer to systems and technology that, whilst we still rely on it, is no longer really up to date. And it's a strange thing. And particularly like this image, because probably 6 months ago, you know, something like a Boeing 747 would have been a thing of luxury and privilege, and has now suddenly become legacy because the world of COVID-19 has kind of suddenly made that legacy. So it can all change very quickly. We're here today to talk a lot about technology as well. This is a good sort of 50, 60-year-old sort of computer setup. But tech, you know, is something that we deal in a lot. We have legacy technology, and it kind of slows us down sometimes in our organisations. And then our processes. Do we actually operate the types of processes that are dynamic and effective for us to work? And Faye's going to talk a bit more about some of those constraints. The next one. Tools that we have in organisations. You know, for a long time we used a lot of set things like Gantt charts and you know, large plans. Are those still longer relevant? Do they hold us back in what we're trying to do in our organisations? And then culture, an interesting one, because a lot of these things all wrap up into that. Do you have a culture? We have some images here that probably portray a historic, maybe someone perceived as a bad drinking culture, through to, you know, do we have the right culture that empowers people and enables them to do what they need to do to be effective at their jobs? But I think when all's said and done, you know, legacy isn't just a shorthand for anything negative. You know, the Olympic Park has left a great legacy for London, and the whole Olympics itself left a great legacy for the country. So legacy is something that really has a tremendous amount of value for us as well, in terms of, you know, we build our business on it, we still run our businesses on it. So we can't always just kind of dismiss it and write it off. And also, you know, trying to future-proof things. I'm sure lots of people bought some very expensive, large computers over the years thinking they would last a long time. And as cycles evolve, things get shorter and shorter. And I think what that all leads us to is a conclusion with legacy is that we live in a world that is constantly evolving. So there isn't a single solution to what we think is today's legacy, because what we replace it with will be tomorrow's legacy. So we'll just need to move through that over time. But the important thing to remember is that, you know, there is real value wrapped up in that, because a lot of our businesses, be it processes, their technology, it still runs on it, and we've got to help that adapt. And just before I get into a bit more, a quote from someone who's certainly set a trail ablaze across the digital world for the last 2 decades. And the very fact that, you know, this is a reality, and, you know, legacy can hold you down when circumstances change. And we've seen that happen, you know, massively over the last 4 to 5 months. You know, as he says, we can't complain about it. We need to lean into that, and we need a strategy to deal with it. So in terms of making some sense of all of this, so I just want to talk briefly around kind of, you know, being certain around what you want to do when you get into this space. So the first thing, I'm going to talk more about the technology side of things. And I think the first thing to do is to remember that it is about technology. So if you're dealing with a legacy technology challenge, don't kind of go off and dress it up in some quite sort of interesting program language or some construct. You need to stick to some core software engineering and technology type principles and values that are going to help you get there. Because without fixing that underpinning technology, you're not going to move forward with it. You can't just, magically create a new team, create a new language, or put something over the top of it. You do need to get down to, how do you want to work? What are the practices that you're going to have? What are the capabilities your teams are going to have? Because that is in the essence where the new value will come from, in terms of delighting users, giving your staff challenging things to do, and then giving the organisation the tools it needs to move into its next kind of phase. And then ambition is an interesting one. I've been around a long time, and I've seen lots of kind of large, ambitious programs that don't often get there because the thing they set out to do in the first place just wasn't realistic. So there's a spectrum that you need to think along, really. Improving existing things can work. The time I spent in government, we did a lot of things around basically putting some different front-end interfaces on older systems, which we could do relatively quickly, and we could get some value from that. We could also prove some arguments. So sometimes you might just want to do some improvements. Other times you might want to move along a complete replacement because you might have some inherent risk, or you might have some challenges within the technology that means you can't just work around it, you've got to go with it. And somewhere between that, you could go around a gradual replacement. You could break it down into smaller segments. And you don't need to just pick one of these strategies either. You can use them in combination. But the important thing is to be clear about what you're getting into before you start on it, because you don't want to sleepwalk into something. And then technology, or the IT department, or the data processing department, as they called it when I first started, has changed over time. And a lot of our roles have changed. So it used to be a lot about doing and executing things, and now it's actually around making things. So it becomes about the outcome, not so much the process. Today, things much more about responsiveness. And again, in this recent period, we've seen the ability for technology teams to respond has been absolutely paramount. If you look at some of the things the UK government has been able to do, such as getting self-certification tickets online rather than having to go to a GP to get one, was something that was spun up very quickly, which only happened because the government had gone through that transformation 5 to 10 years ago. And then focusing on the outcomes. What's the thing you're actually creating, not the process that creates it or the units of measure that are used around it. But can you get better customer value? Can you get more profit, reduced costs, greater customer satisfaction, whatever it is? And then moving away from that sort of annual budgeting cycle to an ongoing sort of persistent team that's iterative and achieves different goals and delivers value. Then lastly, I think breaking down the barriers between business and technology is a really key thing. Blurring those lines is quite important, and making that part of your strategy is a really key thing, because most businesses nowadays are IT businesses. They rely so much on it. So not having those two areas closely coupled will not make you successful. And then, there's lots of things changing out there. This graph kind of shows where complexity and cost of refactoring existing sort of code is going up over time, but actually the cost of rewriting some of it is getting cheaper. And I'll talk a bit about some of the different tactics you can use to do that. But then we also have like different cloud platforms that can give you building blocks to build on top of as well. So, and just the sheer amount of products that you can consume that are out there now solve some of those problems for you, whether it's orchestrating with containers or microservices. They're there, you can consume them, you don't have to build these things, and you get all the stuff baked in with those. So the rise of platforms actually makes this journey a little bit simpler. So in terms of, so talk about a few of the kind of tactics that we use, and again, they're not mutually exclusive. They can be used in combination. So the thin slice concept isn't a new one, but it's a good way to kind of plot an end-to-end path through something. Instead of just building the next thing you see, taking an end-to-end value chain and understanding if it's viable, and then quickly showing to whether it's business stakeholders or actually with real customers, where value lies, where the problems might be, you can understand complexity. And we've used this with one of our clients, Sainsbury's, to actually cut through a lot of complex Oracle infrastructure and business flows around that to help them get pricing changes to tills, but just focused on the simple process of getting those pricing changes into tills. And then we're able to test that out, push it end to end, so that they could actually learn, how easy it was to do and where they're liable to hit problems with that. So that's one tactic. Then monoliths, which is a common thing we see in a lot of enterprises, which are large systems, which are very sort of closely coupled and appear literally as a monolith. And this is really about breaking things down, and you hear them referred to as things like strangler patterns and things like that. But it means that you can actually chunk this thing up into bite-sized pieces that you can actually deal with, and not try and replace the whole thing in one go. And that has several advantages. It means that you can deliver value earlier and you can kind of de-risk your final implementation. And it also means that you can try different sort of solutions in different spaces of that system as well. And again, we've used this where you've typically got 15-year-old systems, 20-year-old systems, and you need to do things like remove some of the risk in that. So a lot of these older code bases don't have things like automated tests in them, so they're quite challenging to change. So you can start to introduce those sort of practices as you break these things apart. And I think the other key thing to remember when you're dealing with sort of monolithic core systems is to be very wary of the things that have grown up around them. And what we see in a lot of our projects we do with clients, we're kind of called in to tackle the core system, but all the kind of spreadsheets and reporting and stuff that's grown up around them, you need to be really wary of those, because you'll find that half the business runs on those as much as it does on these core systems. One more. And then microservices, which is basically a way to kind of break down some of those monoliths, actually, in a practice we commonly use, where you have common capabilities that can be shared and consumed. So with any large system, there will be activities where you take pieces of data from one system and you move them to another, or you update the status. You can create little systems that are able to do that, which means they're scalable, they're flexible, they can be used. And if you're using cloud-based infrastructure, then they work really well. And we've used these in a couple of different automotive projects that we've undertaken, where you can actually break down the enterprise, look at the different components and capabilities you need to fulfill a business need, and then recreate those as microservices. So again, in combination with something like breaking down a monolith, it's a really powerful way to do it. And the sort of platforms I talked about earlier give you great orchestration tools to manage these. So I'm going to stop talking about the technology there, and I'm going to hand over to Faye now, who's going to talk a bit about some of the realities of implementing this in a modern business.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm sure you'll all agree that all of that great new technology, that opportunity sounds fantastic. But of course, what we always have to do is overlay opportunity with reality, and a reality of our ability to pay for it, ability to deliver it. And of course, today's reality is that we have all been hit by a pandemic. And what that means is obviously budgets are tight for many of us, for most of us even, and boardroom agendas are completely packed with discussion of how to deal with the situation we're in. And let's face it, even at the best of times, change like this is hard. And it's tackling modernisation, it's expensive. The perception is it takes a long time, it costs you millions, and it doesn't take you very far forward because it's replacing old for new. Now, a lot of that is not true. It is a perception. Some of it is true in part, of course. We all know it can be expensive, but it can also deliver exponential value. Short-term workarounds, bolt-ons, as I'm sure we all know, only take you so far. And most organisations, if you don't have a continuous improvement strategy, have to face modernisation at some point. But the good news is that there is huge benefit to be had from modernising to ensure that your business is as ready for anything as it possibly can be. The benefit that today's modern technology brings with it, that once upon a time might have seemed long-term, intangible, perhaps really hard to quantify, are now lifelines, essential routes to value, specifically that location independence that's come with cloud. I'm sure many organisations out there, many of you, are feeling very, very pleased that you undertook that programme. Other organisations may be suddenly realising what all the fuss was about. Equally, that flexibility and speed and responsiveness that modernisation can deliver, as Mike talked about, is a huge boost for organisations, especially right now when struggling to survive in a rapidly changing and uncertain environment. But let's move on. Let's look at specifically how modernisation today can enable and create value. Mike talked about 3 areas of modernisation. He talked about technology, people and process, and all 3 need to work together. So first of all, the technology. So in a previous role, as Mike explained, he talked a lot about breaking down the monolith, and that's in a previous role, we set about systematically re-architecting our technology estate. This broke apart an interwoven ERP system that had become impossible to integrate with or change without significant effort for even the smallest of changes. So modern adjustments like adding payment methods or extending cut-off times for online orders were really, really difficult without very long timelines, and they were very costly. And these things, you can't not do them. They're essential for customer satisfaction. So by undertaking the work to deconstruct the architecture, we were able to make those changes ultimately much more quickly, much more effectively, being more responsive to customer need and the business need. What this work also enabled us to do was to integrate modern startup technologies that were absolutely game-changing. You know, people talk about this opportunity. It is real, but you do need to have the infrastructure to be able to make the most of new technologies that are available to transform traditional processes. And the transformations that we undertook gave the business significant competitive advantage. And as I understand it, obviously no longer there anymore, but in recent months, the new architecture has meant that the organisation was able to make sudden tweaks to the order flow to be able to respond to changes to the business that were a direct impact from COVID-19. But moving on to process, all of this would not have been as effective or probably even possible without changes to our ways of working. We changed our ways of working both at the level of decision making and in how we developed code and collaborated as a team. So we managed to get the company leadership team to prioritise rigorously and regularly to ensure that we were always focusing on the parts of the big picture that would deliver the business the most value. But people and culture go together. So moving on to people, you cannot implement new processes as effectively without changing your ways of thinking and your ways of collaborating as a team. People often talk about implementing agile processes. Agile isn't a process, it is a set of principles that is accompanied by a very distinct mindset. And you know, modernisation is absolutely critical to review one's culture, your management, your people, alongside your processes and technology. And one of the key benefits of looking at your people and your management and your culture is that your people can be your greatest asset, particularly in times of crisis like this. All businesses today need all the help that they can get to achieve value and to drive the business forward. So if, as a business, you can set the outcomes that you need to be delivered and empower your people to deliver them, helping them understand the part that they play, what they need to do, what they need to aim at. This is an excellent route to success. It saves you time. It motivates people to be able to know where they're going, what they need to deliver, and to be left to go deliver it. And the results are better. And I can say that from sort of personal experience of having taken the plunge, but it's not easy. It does take a lot of confidence and there will be bumps in the road, but it is worth the effort. And I guess that brings us on to the final slide from me, which is around, I guess, addressing the challenges. If this was easy, we'd all be doing it, or we'd all have done it by now. But there are challenges to change and barriers that have to be confronted in order to be successful. This is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure you will think of many more. These are some that sort of I think are priorities for me. First of all, so moving through them, executive disbelief or executive buy-in. It can be very hard to get senior members of the business or commercial members of the business to understand and to buy into large, expensive, complex technology transformation programs. My advice is don't talk about cloud transformation. Yes, be clear about the technology change that you're undertaking and what it is, and be specific about it, but talk about your transformation in terms of the outcomes, what you're trying to achieve. Use business language to articulate the benefit and the outcomes that the underlying technology change will be delivering. There may be several steps between the core technology change, so this delivers that, then that delivers that, and eventually you get to the meaningful outcome for your executive, but that story is really, really important. The second thing is, these programs are big and they're unwieldy, and it can feel like a massive task to embark on these things. Very, very hard to mobilize. Best advice, approach the change in a structured way, get help. You can't do these things in business as usual. You need a dedicated team for it. Engage someone to manage it for you, and look at where you need help across people, process and technology to make the change happen, because change is different from business as usual. Make sure all of your team members know the part that they are playing, and get your team engaged, get your executive on board and keep them there. And that's really important. They might come on board at the end, you need to keep them there. Build the roadmap of outcomes, not just the activities, and that will all give you momentum to start the change and keep the change rolling. Thirdly, change resistance. We all know change is hard. Change that isn't managed will give you unexpected outcomes, without a doubt. Manage the change proactively, and that's not just about communications, it's broader than that. Decide how your particular organisation needs to approach the change, but most importantly, don't try to get there in one step. And what change is for you, it could be very different from a different organisation. So understand where you're trying to get to, the steps that you need to take to get there, and be proactive about that change management. The fourth one, I think that's four, yes, business desire for value. I'm sure many of you will identify with the fact that you are constantly, businesses need to deliver projects and programs in year that deliver benefit in year. It's the way business works. And I'm sure many of you who are technical leaders will empathise with the fact that commercial leaders are not always interested in your discussions about technical debt, and they will push for the more interesting immediate projects. My advice is here, try to build, similar to the advice around point one, is build the story, show how your underlying change will ultimately make the things that they're interested in on an annual basis quicker, easier and cheaper to deliver. That will be a hard sell, but it is a story that people will understand, and many people will be happy to wait a while in order to be able to deliver change more quickly in the future. The last one around investment. Investment's always constrained. Yeah. Work on the basis that you will only ever need to do half of what you think you will. Prioritization is key. Focus on your outcomes and focus on what is most needed for most of the important outcomes, and deliver the change one piece at a time. I can guarantee as you progress with the program, requirements will fall away. Get started and never stop prioritizing. And that brings me to the last point, which isn't on the list, but it kind of wraps all of it up really, is good governance is absolutely essential. Being agile does not mean not having governance. It means having modern governance. It means engaging leaders in prioritization and setting outcomes to support your teams and being empowered to make the right decisions. I'm going to hand back to Mike now for the next section. Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. So I was just going to talk a bit about sort of where we are now. So in terms of, what we can do. So I think, any business that hasn't been through a sort of a tough 3 or 4 months is a very lucky one. But, I think at this point in time, it's good to understand what that has done to your organisation, your people, your customers, and understand how you've reacted to that. And then what new constraints you've got around security, your networks, your people, the suppliers, and any sort of contracts you have. And just get a sense of where you are now, because we all had to react very quickly and do things very differently. But now is a good time, I think, to just start to see where we are, because unfortunately, this may be something that's around for a while, and we may, have various flavours of this type of disruption for the coming months. So if we move to the next one. So once we know where we are, then we've got to think about what our sort of midterm adaption is. So, you know, remote working models are everywhere now, but there isn't kind of one size fits all for that. So that actually needs some thought, it needs some planning, it probably needs a bit of experimentation and getting the right tooling around that as well. Again, I imagine a lot of people adopted various types of tooling. You know, who wishes they bought shares in Zoom 8 months ago, for example. But, you know, not all those tools have been successful. Some of the things we did before just don't do anymore. And some of the things we need to kind of reinvigorate. And, you know, some of that is the less scripted and formal contact that we have with people, getting back to those informal chats. How are we going to do that? And then you've got to think about, well, how do we now change the business as its first priority, i.e. it's normal, as opposed to it being something that we always feel we're going to react to. So not kind of try and get back to where we were, but get to a state where if something like this happens again, it will be less disruptive. And then having understood that, I think it's then just about being prepared. You know, maintaining strong customers and this relationships through customers, this new world is really important. A lot of the typical channels, be they face-to-face, be they contact center, have been particularly disrupted by this whole situation. If you had, you know, a very sort of tin and wires type of contact center that needed people on site, didn't have access to a cloud-based solution, or even just cloud-based routing, which is a 15, 20-year-old technology, you know, you would have struggled a lot through this period. If you relied on face-to-face contact, no chance at all. So anyone who had a modern, adaptive digital interface was able to change the way they dealt with their customers and still service them. And then that might identify some competitive advantages you might have or new markets you could move into. Did anyone in your supply chain not survive this? And is that a space you could move into and maybe operate in? So you've got to look at what else, you know, you could be doing as a result of this, because, you know, we're fairly certain things won't go back to how they were. And I'm kind of, I'm drawn back to a great phrase that Faye had on one of her slides around calm waters have allowed risks to be deprioritized. I think there's probably a lot of organizations around mid-April thinking, I used to go to a lot of presentations around digital and cloud and transformation, and I thought it was just window dressing, but the people who've already done that were in a much stronger position. But now is the time to kind of get on and do some of these things, because there will be a period where hopefully we won't see anything like the disruption we've seen in the first wave of this, but this is going to be a feature of life. So now is a really good time to start adapting and changing and being ready for what happens next. And I'm going to hand back to Faye to sort of sum things up for us.
There we go. You can finish the webinar without a good old, oh, hang on, I'm on mute moment, could you? So thank you, Mike. In summary, I think what Mike said at the end there was sort of very pertinent, really. Right now might seem the worst time in the world to think about major programs like this, but I think the point is, if one can afford to modernize today, and if you need to modernize and you can possibly afford to invest, do it now to realize the value as soon as possible, because it's about being ready for anything, I suppose. It's about exploiting the technology opportunity to make your business as resilient and as ready as it possibly can be. But the key messages through our presentation is around, I guess, approaching the change systematically. As per the slide here, I guess, understand your situation, set your goals and get everybody on board. Organize, invest in good program infrastructure and organization. It's not business as usual, it's big, and it does need to be approached as such. Analyze, don't rush in, get input, explore your options. And then finally, deliver. Get the right delivery team, think about what you need to be successful. Even if the changes are painful, make the changes in order to set yourself up for success, and focus on delivering outcomes, not systems. I should say, and systems.
Thanks, Faye. While Faye and Mike help themselves to a glass of water, you're not finished yet, because we've got some questions that have come through on chat. And I should also mention, as I'm just getting the questions up, that we'll be sharing the recording to the session, so you can share it with colleagues and watch it back. Do you have any advice on kicking off a complex project under these remote working conditions? So I'll ask that to Faye. please?
Well, remote working is something we've all had to sort of if we weren't already, we had to get very, very used to in the last 6 months, and I'm sure some love it and some don't. I think in some ways it can be easier to undertake some of these complex programs in a remote environment, and I'm sure there's a lot of sort of perplexed faces or kind of disagreement with that mentally at the moment. But from my point of view, it forces you to be more structured. It forces you to be more purposeful about your approach. It forces you to also think about your engagement, who you need to speak to, how often you need to speak to people, and because it's so easy to get caught up in day to day. But one does have to think about how you replace that natural collaboration that makes programs successful. So the ad hoc chats, the coffee machine conversation, you have to think also about team motivation and how you replace that in a remote environment. So I would say it's about thinking how the outcomes that you want for communication and engagement and exchange of information, and how you can then translate that into the remote world. As Mike said, there are lots of new tools out there, some that enable you to do remote workshops, and lots of different things out there, but it does take a bit of getting used to. So one thing I would say is build time into your plan for people to get used to that new way of working.
Yeah. And clarity of communication, as you say, is so key.
Absolutely. And also not overwhelming people, thinking about and coordinating all of your meetings. And that comes back to sort of having leadership and being organised about your programme, because I'm sure a lot of us are sort of on Zoom from morning till night, and people have commitments. And so it's about planning and organising your day effectively, so that you don't sort of drain people's batteries, and you can optimise the time that you do spend with people.
Yeah. Definitely, thank you, Faye. Mike, you're up next. What experience do you have, and by you, I think ThoughtWorks, in delivering legacy modernisation projects during COVID-19?
Yes, I had a full head of hair 6 months ago, so that's probably a good indication. So we have one large sort of program on the go at the moment, which is probably one of the largest sort of microservices legacy replacement programs going on in Europe. And that's brought with it some interesting challenges. Firstly, around sort of logistics and people. We're a consultancy firm, so we had a lot of people, circa 100, out working with clients in their offices in 3 or 4 locations across around 7 or 8 different teams. So we went through 2 phases where we worked with that client and agreed that we would cut down on travel to reduce exposure to infection. And we started on some sort of resiliency plan with them in February time. So in March, we were starting to carry out the first phase of that. We executed on that and managed to move 100 odd people into either our own offices or offices sort of nearer base locations. And then 10 working days later, the government brought in the edict of working from home, where people had to essentially then move out of those offices. So we had to move all these teams kind of twice within about 15 days, which, you know, took a lot of coordination, but we were able to do that without kind of missing a beat in terms of velocity and delivery. So I think, you know, that's been an interesting facet of this. Firstly was that. Then there's the whole process of adapting those teams, so that their ceremonies change, their ways of working change, and the relationships change with those teams. And you have to kind of check in on people a lot more. Your people's stewardship and well-being of the teams takes on a real paramount importance through those early days. So, you know, we got through a lot of that. The teams were very stable. They were able to keep doing the work they needed to do. Client's been amazing, and they're not someone who's been really that exposed to remote working, but they've adapted to it really well. And we've kind of been able to help them with some of the tooling and things like that. And now we're kind of in a really good space where I think our general discourse with the client is that we wouldn't go back to a sort of an on-site working model, because we found that has worked really well. And we're now resuming go lives, or, you know, putting into production of large chunks of the systems now that their business has stabilized since the disruption they had from the initial sort of lockdown period. So I think, you know, that is a good case in point really of doing this type of large scale legacy replacement. through this type of historical period that it can be done. It's not easy, and I'm not, by no means what I say I'm trying to make it look easy. It's very hard, but if you've got the right approach and the right team, you can do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Hope your hair grows back. Faye, I was going to ask the next question to you. Process change is tough even under normal circumstances. When the current environment is so uncertain, how do change leaders keep the business informed and engaged with any new program? So I guess you partly answered that before, but
I did, but I guess I'd add to my first answer by saying, have a think or a look. If you've got children, teenage children particularly, that you're allowed to use social media and various other different video platforms and things, have a look at how they communicate and how they share information, because I think that the move to sort of remote collaboration, that is a great example of how it is possible to share information really easily and really, really well in a non-physical environment. And the answer to I guess the change management answer to that question is that one would engage, change champions, and they would then engage their departments, and you can do it sort of virally in essence, and that viral collaboration and communication can still happen in the virtual world. I think you just have to think about the physical things that you used to do, and then how they translate into the virtual environment.
That's fair. Thank you. Mike, I was going to ask you this next question, but Faye, obviously, if you wanted to chip in as well. Do you agree with the developer-centric definition of legacy as code without automated tests? Or do you find that, tactically speaking, other technical or cultural problems are often bigger?
Yeah, I think it's bigger than just that very tight developer definition. There's nothing wrong with that definition, and as I alluded to, that's where a lot of the risk lies when you start getting into these legacy code bases, is that because they don't have any automated tests or harnesses, they are quite high risk places to be, and you need quite experienced devs to go in there. But I think everything that sits around that some of the stuff Faye's talked around, the organisation and culture, is important. The ways of working are really important, and if you try and change this stuff without considering all those factors, you're unlikely to be successful, or you could just end up doing a sort of a refactoring of what you had in the past, which might give you a newer version of something you already had, but you miss a huge opportunity to maybe do things differently or do them better, or stop doing things because you might have been valuable 25 years ago, but they're not valuable now.
Yeah, I would build on that and say, for me, legacy is about, I guess, where the need has changed, so that the requirements have changed. So something, it only becomes legacy when it is no longer completely fit for purpose, or we create need. I think a lot of the time with some of the technology that we have, technology has moved on. Our requirements for that technology has moved on. A basic Nokia phone versus an iPhone, our need for a handheld communication device has moved on, so it's become legacy. So for me, it's around the requirement. I can completely understand the code without automated tests, but that's because our capability, I suppose, for automating tests has moved on, and so therefore our requirement for that automation to do things quicker and cheaper and easier has moved on.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got two more questions, if you can handle it. So does the panel feel that corporate structures are built around pre-existing systems and practices? If so, how can there simply be a tech-only solution?
Happy to jump in there, Mike, if you want to sort of have a think and jump in afterwards. But I don't think there is a simple tech-only solution, and I think that's kind of the point. There can never just be tech only, because tech has got to have a purpose. It's got to have an outcome. It has a use in an organisation. Do I feel that corporate structures are built around pre-existing systems and practices? Yes. And I think that's why so many organisations struggle to, change is hard. And depending on how big a shift your customer base has taken, or your purpose has shifted, will determine how much change you need to undertake as an organisation. It's certainly not just about technology, albeit changing the technology to sometimes that not forces change into business, but encourages change in other areas of business. Mike, anything else?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't think you could just do a tech change, but like most things in life, it depends. I wouldn't start any project without looking at the broader business. And there's a technique that I love called Wardley mapping, which if you have a chance, look it up, which is basically a value chain that you can set against the scale of evolution. So going back to the Nokia versus the iPhone argument, there was a time when an iPhone was an exciting new thing, and it's a kind of a commodity type thing now. It doesn't really do anything it didn't do 5 years ago. It just does it a bit better and oddly more expensively. But anyway, I won't go into that. So basically all technology evolves, but also it has a differing value to you as an organization. So if you are creating an amazing customer experience that gives you a competitive advantage over someone, that is a really valuable piece of technology. If you are storing data on a magnetic disk, everyone can do that. So replacing just technology in a commodity sense is probably something you can do quite cost effectively and quite cheaply. But as you move up that value chain and you move away from commodity to Genesis type technology, which drives your business, then you've got to think of it in the full round of what it means to your business, because it is your business.
I'm just reading the first part of that question again, actually. And I think, the point that, do we feel that corporate structures are built around pre-existing systems and practices? No, I think it's the other way around, actually, is off that certainly it depends which industry you look at. And as Mike says, it depends. A lot of pre-existing systems are built around previous corporate structures or previous customer requirements or ways of operating a business and practices. And I think as customer requirements change, therefore business practice change, therefore the systems become legacy because they're no longer quite doing what the business needs it to do in order to satisfy that customer need. So I actually think it's the other way around.
Okay, thank you. I noticed actually there isn't an extra question, so you have a reprieve, the two of you, but thank you so much. So from tidal waves to teenagers to iPhones, this has been a really informative session. Thank you. And for those of you that dialed in, I should mention another event that we've got taking place in just over a month on the 8th to the 10th of September. It's called ThoughtWorks Live. It's designed for business leaders and technologists that have attended the call today. We'll be talking about value from volatility, and we've got customer speakers from Motability Operations, from NHS. We've got Gina Miller, as a well-known activist, all talking about how we'll be able to use this period of time to really move beyond business continuity to really thinking about resilience in our organisations and how we can bounce back from the pandemic. It should be hugely insightful, sponsoring London Tech Week alongside. So as a follow-up to the session, you should receive an invite to that, and we hope to see you in just over 4 weeks. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a good afternoon.